To John chapter 9, we're going to start with verse 1. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, Jesus said, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I'm in the world, I'm the light of the world. Having said this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. The word means sent. And so the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbors and those who had formerly seen him were begging, asked, is it this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, no, it just looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. And they demanded, how then were your eyes open? He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud, put it on my eyes, and told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. Where is this man? They asked him. I don't know, he said. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner do such a miraculous sign? So they were divided. Finally, they turned again to the blind man and said, what have you to say about him? It was your eyes that he opened. And the man replied, he's a prophet. The Jews still did not believe that he had been blind and received his sight until they sent for his parents. Is this your son, they asked? Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that he can see now? We know he is our son, the parents answered, and we know he was born blind. But now he can see now. But how he can see now, or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for already the Jews had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ, or Messiah, would be put out of the synagogue. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for the day you've given us, especially at this time, the opportunity to study your word. Guide us in all truth and help us to apply it. In your son's name, amen. Okay, last week we took a look at another miracle at another pool that was found in John. It was the one at the pool of Bethesda. In this particular case, Jesus walks up and chose a man out of the entire multitude, a man that had been an invalid for 38 years. If you'll recall, he told him to pick up his mat and to walk, and that was significant. Because the Jews started chastising the man immediately for carrying his mat. And his response is, well, he told me to. And so we find that Jesus told him that when Jesus met him later, that he told him that something worse could happen to him if he didn't stop sinning. And when you think of worse, that means worse than being an invalid for 38 years. So something worse physically and more significantly spiritually was the implication. The religious elites, they went after Jesus for telling him this, to carry his mat on the Sabbath. They felt like it was a challenge to the Sabbath. So last week we took a look at Jesus and the Sabbath in a little more depth. And a couple things we dealt with or looked at was the fact that this particular incident in John was more about the Sabbath than it was about the miracle. The miracle it seemed to be an intent to try to provoke the Pharisees or the Jews, the religious, in order to get them to debate this, because it was really about the Sabbath. He picked one person out of the entire crowd in order to cause this to happen, and told him specifically to carry his mat. It was a comparison basically between the righteousness of man, as defined by the Pharisees and all their list of rules of what you got to do and how you got to do it in order to be a righteous before God, versus Jesus, who's basically saying put your faith in him, trust in him. It was also, we look back in creation, how the origination of the intent, or that was referred back to in the commandment, had to do with creation. And God rested, or what it means is he stopped working because everything was complete and perfect, and everything that could be done was there. So it was a matter of stopping and looking back and reflecting upon all the greatness that had been done. And that was where, when the commandment was made, it was made to reflect back on that same basic idea, that the Sabbath is a time of rest. It was made holy, or sanctified, set apart, and a time to reflect on what God had done. Went on to look at the fact that the Sabbath was not meant for God or Christ, and that was the point Jesus was trying to make, was that he was God, and therefore it didn't apply to him. But the Sabbath instead was because of God, because of what he had done for them. And then the last thing we looked at last week was the purpose of the sign. As we mentioned last week, we'll look at it again this week. When we look at the miracles in John, John has a different idea about the miracles. He doesn't show the miracles to show how magnificent he was or how powerful he was, even though the miracles obviously do that. But he always had, when he only picked out 7 of them, he had something in mind when he did that. And he calls it as a sign. And as we pointed out last week, John's whole purpose of writing is written at the end of the book. It says it's in order that you may believe, and in believing that you'll have life. And so here he is, he's trying to show this miracle as a sign that this was the man to believe in, and by doing that you would have life. That's his goal. So when we looked at that, and we looked at the purpose of this sign, we went on and looked at how God, his Son, as well, Jesus, is always working. He goes on to explain more about what's happened behind the miracle. God is always working, and the Sabbath does not apply to them, either one of them. And the Son does amazing things just like his Father. In other words, he has the same power as his Father, he does the same things. Therefore, this miracle testifies that he is God, and he is above the Sabbath. It goes on to say that the Son was given the authority to judge. His judgment, remember how the Pharisees' judgment was, it was about their set of rules and how it applied to them so they could say how good they were. Okay? It was about themselves. Christ's judgment is not about that. It's about what's important to God. So that's what he goes on to spell out. And he goes on to say that the work of the Father, or the miracles, are a testify that he is the Christ. That's really what John was trying to get across. Because when he talks about the miracles, they're a sign. He's saying this magnificent power that he did on the Sabbath clearly shows that he was equal to God. And because of that, you need to put faith in him, not the Pharisees' list of rules. Okay? So today we're going to look at another incident that takes place on the Sabbath. It's another miracle that John refers to as the sign. And this is the one we just read about the man being born blind. All right? So, when we look at this, we see it, and where does it take place? Jerusalem. Jerusalem. Near a pool, near another place of water. What's the name of that pool? Siloam. Okay? So he's near this other pool, not at the pool, but near it. And he's there with who? His disciples. I didn't catch that until today. Of course, I probably did it one time before, but I just forgot. And it dawned on me that this wasn't a conversation with people he was teaching, or Pharisees, or groups, or whatever. This was something, he was walking along with his disciples. And the disciples asked him a question. Matter of fact, a lot of times, a lot of the conversations that Jesus had are prompted because the disciples have questions. And the question was, what? Who sinned? This man or his parents? They were looking at him. He was a blind beggar sitting beside the road asking for somebody to provide for him. And they looked at him and they asked a question. Why would they ask that question?
I don't believe among the Jews that anytime something happened, that it was either that person or
their parents.
Descendant that previously
As a matter of fact, I forgot to write something down.
I sometimes wonder if we don't do the same thing now.
Yeah.
We wonder if it's our fault. Something happened. We know it really shouldn't be, but I think
Right.
sometimes we wonder.
Well, the Bible says that, sometimes God punishes that generation and to the what generation? Fourth generation, and talks about those things. And so that does come into effect sometimes. And so that's one of the things that probably has been grown over the years, but it was probably made as a justification. How many people walked down the road and saw this beggar every day? How many times they walked over and stepped over and said, well, it's his own fault? Especially now I don't have to do anything about it. Remember the man on the road to Jericho? Got beat up? How many people stepped over him? Okay, and so it may have been that situation. I don't know. But basically, they knew that there was something about it, and they didn't really understand it completely. Neither do we. But, so they basically asked this question in order to say that. Who sinned? Notice Jesus never said that does not apply. In every single case here, he never said it doesn't apply. But what he did say is explain this situation. Yeah.
In another place, he quotes the prophets as saying that there was a time coming when deciding that the man eats the grapes and his children's teeth are set on the edge will no longer apply, that every man will be
Accountable for their own sins. Yep. Okay?
So that was it. And Jesus quoted that as saying that the time was nigh.
Time was coming. It's right there. Okay? Good point. But when we think about it, if you look back, when God does things like that, he has done, and I wrote pen to write it down, I forgot, so I'll come back to it when it hits me again. Never mind. I was combing my hair, and I thought, oh yeah, I need to do that. You see how short my memory is. It goes fast. All right. Whether this, but he goes on to give the reason for this specific instance, okay? Whether this happened so that the work of God could be displayed. Now, there's this particular incident, there was a specific reason that this was going to take place. They asked the question, and he goes, no. This man was put here because I was going to walk down this road one day, and when I walked down this road, something was going to happen. And it was going to be able to glorify God. He goes on to tell them, before he even does that, he says that he is what? What does Jesus describe himself as? The light of the world. He's already called himself that. In fact, this is John writing. Remember when we studied John? Light, life, love. It's all about it. Those three things. He's already said that he's the light. And here he is. He says, the light. I'm the light of the world. I'm here. And while the light is here, what do you do? Do things with the light. Get to work. And so he proceeds from there and does the miracle. In this particular miracle, he says that he puts a mixture of mud and spit, or clay and spit, which is mud, I guess, and he puts it on the man's eyes. Is that healing? No. What do you have to do? He had to go to the water. Did Jesus take him to the water? Put him in the water? No. He said, go to the water. Go to the pool of Siloam and wash it, and you'll be able to see. And when he did this, the fact of the matter was he was able to see. Now, his neighbors and those around him were kind of stunned. As a matter of fact, some of them wasn't sure it was him. You ever thought about that? These are people who knew him and saw him, but they didn't really. Part of them said, yeah, that's him. And the others said, no, I don't think so. Why?
Because he was supposed to be blind.
Supposed to be blind and sitting at the side of the road. Have you ever gone into Walmart? Teachers? Have you ever gone into Walmart and run into somebody and go, yeah, I know you. They're not where you saw them last. You saw them at a parent-teacher conference, or you saw them at as a student or whatever. We all do that. Or you go to another town and you walk into church, you're sitting down and you see somebody and say, that look familiar. Well, yeah, you've known them all your life. You ever done that? And then all of a sudden, ding, ding, ding. That's what we're sitting here seeing. Most of the time, what they saw was a man who was down here going, give me money, can you help me? They never saw him walking around doing things, so it just didn't add up. The mind does that. So we find they're in the situation, they're debating about whether it really is him or not. And so he asked him what to do, and the man says, no, it's me. There's this guy, his name, I think I heard his name was Jesus. Didn't see him, but I heard him being referred to as Jesus, and he opened my eyes. All of a sudden, now things are starting to go, really? So what do those people do? Gotcha. As a matter of fact, they said, no, wait a minute. This is Sabbath day. See, they throw that in after the fact kind of as a note, John does. It was the Sabbath day, so then that kind of gives them a little bit of motives for why all the rest of it takes place. So he goes and he takes them and takes them to the Pharisees, the leaders, the religious leaders, and says, this guy said he used to be blind, and now he says he can see. They said, really? How'd that happen? Didn't happen. This is a Sabbath day. Nothing like that's supposed to happen. Somebody had to heal you? No. And so this miracle takes place. He's challenged before the Jews. The Pharisees start going after him and said that Jesus was not from God because he did not keep the Sabbath. I mean, if he was from God, obviously, he wouldn't have done anything like that on the Sabbath day. He had to be. Of course, last week we talked about the Sabbath and the problem with this particular conversation. And others, on the other hand, said, well, wait a minute, but how can a sinner do something so miraculous? And since it was so miraculous, they were kind of divided on what to do. It's because, okay, you can't say one thing, it causes you a problem on the other side. You say another, it causes you a problem over here. So they looked at the man and said, okay, buddy, who did this? What do you think this guy is? They're going to throw the blame on him. They're hoping that he'll say, I don't know, or whatever, walk away. Instead, he says, I think he has to be a prophet. Now, prophets could see things in the future. They could see things that were happening. They could tell you what's going on. Many of them were able to perform miracles. It had to be something like that, what he was basically trying to say. Had to be one of them. Of course, that's the last thing they wanted to hear. What does the prophet do in healing on the Sabbath? And so then they basically took debate with the fact that whether he really was blind or not. And so they pretty much tried to squash the whole idea he was blind and tried to say it was a fake, he was a fraud, it was a trick. Even to the point that they called in his parents. The parents came in, what did they say?
He's their son.
Yeah, I can tell you, he's my son. I can tell you, he was born blind. I can tell you, he sees me. Beyond that, I'm not going any further than that because y'all going to be mad at us.
He's an adult. Let him answer for us.
Yeah, because
they threw him under the bus.
They did. They did. Because they knew that if they told them any more than that, what was going to happen to them? They'd be kicked out of the synagogue, which basically meant in Israel at that time they'd be excommunicated from the community. That was social. That was more than just go to church on Saturday. That was your connection, your everything about your life and everything around you, whatever. Okay? So they didn't want this to happen. They'd already been told what was going to happen if you turn around and said this Jesus was the Messiah. All right, so we see that this takes place, and then we look at it from there. The next thing I want us to do, last week we took a look at, and both of these deal with the Sabbath day. Last week we took some emphasis on what about the Sabbath. This week I want to take an emphasis on sin. The question came up last week about sin. This guy had been an invalid for 38 years, which means he could have done something that caused it or not or what, but it never really said relating to sin. This week it's saying his parents didn't do it. It was done for another reason. So we look at this, I want to look at the first thing. When John writes this, that's the first thing he brings up. Okay, before the miracle takes place, he basically brings up who sinned, this man or his parents. So this is one of the things he wants us as a reader and those who read his writing to get a handle on. Okay, that's kind of what he wants us to learn. So when he does this, he starts talking about sin and consequences. Who sinned, this man or others? Because the reality is, there is a cause and effect. Right? Yeah? There always is. There's an effect. Now the question is, what kind of effect? Sometimes it's more worse than others. And it's the same with sin. There's always a consequence. Sometimes it doesn't seem to appear in this world, but it will eventually come around. There is always a cause and effect. There's always a consequence to sin. All right? And this, when we look at that type of situation, man's sin always has an effect in this world and the next. Sometimes it doesn't appear to be in this world. We may not see it, and it may be minimalized, but it always catches up in the end, just like we mentioned a minute ago. One of the examples of this, I took a biblical example Wednesday night, Lloyd's teaching in 2 Samuel. We spent some time there. Remember a guy named David? Remember what David did? We studied this. And the end result was a whole chain of events that were consequences because of David's sin. Okay? David did it. David paid the price. David did it. And who else paid the price? There was a son. First thing that happened here about 6 to 9 months later. We have a boy that dies. Okay? He pays for it. We look in next one I come with Amnon. Amnon looks up and says, well, it's no big deal. You're the king. You can get away with anything you want when it comes to a woman. So what does he do? He sins. He rapes his sister, stepsister. Who pays for it? So we look at that consequence of that sin. We see that she reaps the result of that. It was not her fault, was it? But it was the fault of somebody else. On the other hand, Ammon, he reaps the consequence of his sin. What happens to him? Absalom kills him. All this becomes an effect that has consequences on the entire family of David and his kingdom. We look at Absalom and what he did, and we see the consequences that came along because of that. In all those situations, you see a multitude of different things happening that cause consequences for the individual, as well as others that were around them at the time. Sin has consequences that are caused by ourselves and other people. That's a fact. That's something that we need to understand. I remember, in the days when we did, foster care, dealt with a situation where I had to go down to a house. The mother was basically a crackhead. Okay? 3 kids. They were hauling her to jail. Did she have consequences? Yes. What about those 3 kids? Yes. It significantly impacted them. Was it their fault that their mother was sinned in this way? Absolutely not. But the consequences come because of actions of themselves and on yourself and others. Yes, sir?
You always reap what you sow.
You reap what you sow. And sometimes other people do. What about the drunk? Drive down the road. Goes across the road and hits somebody. Happens all the time. It's a sin. Shouldn't have been there. Instead, sometimes ends up maimed or crippled for life. Sometimes the persons that he runs into end up in that situation. Sometimes both of them end up dead. Sin has consequences for the individual as well as others around them. So we need to understand that a lot of things that happen in our life are because of things we did. A lot of things that happen in our life are because of things other people did. That's a fair question to ask. And the reality is, sometimes that's the case. Is it always? No, Jesus just got done saying that's not always the case. All right, let's talk about another one. In Genesis chapter 3, we pick a woman. We find a woman named Eve. Now, actually, we didn't blame it on Adam. Paul does in Romans. We talk about Adam and his sin, and we look at that and the consequences of that sin, that decision to trust in himself, caused what? What would happen? They would surely die. But you know what else? What else died? Everything. They kicked out of the garden, and suddenly this beautiful place, this garden, you ever watch the movie or the Camelot? Everything's refreshed and nice and neat, and it's a place, garden, it's a heaven, it's a whatever you want to call it, where nothing is, the rain never rains, but everything gets watered, the sun's always there, and that's what we're talking about heaven, basically. Well, this situation, we're looking at this, and suddenly it's gone. By the sweat of your brow, now you got weeds and thorns, you got all these things in this earth. You will physically die, you feel pain. Cain kills his brother. All these different things happen. The fact of the matter is, when sin came into this world, it unleashed death. Death, it starts with destruction. This world is dying. Okay? From that moment on, everything about this world started dying. In fact, the New Testament talks about the earth is groaning, waiting for that day that Jesus will come back and make everything right. Because this whole world is doing. Look at first and second law of thermodynamics, if you've never studied that. Basically it's saying everything's going down. Everything's going to fall apart. This whole world is. When we look at that, what happens around us? A few months ago, something happened in South Carolina. What was it? A storm came from this way, a storm came from this way, and said South Carolina's underwater. One day they had a little earthquake out in the ocean. The waters went and flooded over in Japan, plus other places. What about Haiti? Remember the earthquakes and things that happened here and there? No, you don't have to go far from there. Go what's happening in the West. We're having droughts and fires and all these things. All of these are a result of God not holding creation in check, keeping everything, man, animal, life, everything alive. Instead, it's been released. Sometimes the consequences of things that happen to us today are a result of that initial sin. You happen to be in a place where there's an earthquake. How many of those people got out of the way of the tsunamis that were created by these massive earthquakes in the ocean? Thousands and thousands of people drowned. There was nothing they could do. Was it their fault? No. It was Adam's. It was Adam's. As a result of sin coming into the world, a lot of times things happen as a result of those things. So therefore, a lot of times we go out here, some things happen. Because nature and different things around us cause things and create things. Problems. Look at the destruction, maybe not of life, but sometimes, one of the biggest destructions in Haiti was not necessarily life, but it was what little livelihood they had. So everything over there is in shambles. Still is today. In shambles, no place to live. They got cities made out of just tarps. No place to go. The buildings all fell down. So sometimes it causes economic and all these other kinds of things that happen and go from there. So sometimes when we look around us, we need to see that some things are caused just as a result of Adam bringing sin into this world. The results: destruction, injury, hunger, disease. Think of cancer and all the things that really... You come right home. You don't have to wait for an earthquake in Kimball. You don't have to wait for a tornado that just barely jumps over this building. Think of the disease that has attacked this congregation and the people around you and the people you know. Disease wasn't in the garden. Disease is a result of Adam's sin in this world being left to die because of that. Misery and death. Okay? That's the second thing I want to think about. Third one is this. A lot of times, sins and consequences come because of trials and judgments. What do I mean by that? Have I ever read Revelation? You don't have to read Revelation if you don't understand it. All right, go back to Jeremiah, go back to Amos, go back to whatever. God says that a lot of times He brings sword, famine, and plague. The purpose is to cause a person to make a decision about who they're going to serve. And then a judgment comes. He uses it as a form of judgment. We look at it and He talks about that all throughout time. He uses it repeatedly on His people. Not just His people, but one of the books, and I can't remember, Lloyd could probably tell me in a heartbeat. One of them He goes through and starts talking about that kingdom there, the Syrians, the Amnon, this one, all these different people and how God was going to destroy them because of their sins. Right down and finishing with His people. Isaiah. Okay, it was one of them. Should have picked that one because it's the biggest. It covers them all. Isaiah. God uses that. To understand that a little better, is if and I wrote the wrong thing down. This is wrong. I wrote Jonah. It's not Jonah. It's Job. Have I ever read about Job? God is sitting there, this picture we're given, and getting there, and somebody comes to him. Now, what kind of person was Job? Bad guy? No. God says he was one of the most upright people on this earth. Or maybe he was the most upright at that time. And we find that Satan comes to him, God, and says, yeah, let me try him. Let me test him. Sometimes God says, okay, try him, test him. So what did Job do? He didn't come up and say, I'll offer you $100 if you follow me, did he? What did he do? How did he go after Job? His kids, his life, his home, his business, everything that he valued, he went after it. He just went after it in such a way and brought joy, misery. Sometimes in life, things that happen are because Satan's after you. Satan's after you. And because of that, God says, consider my faithful servant. Put your name in there. And when Satan goes after you, because God allows the trials to take place in order to test us. That's what He talks about in Revelations. It's a test. Do you really have faith in me, or do you really have faith in yourself? You know, if you really never give it a choice, that's not faith, is it? You know, if you only got one road to go down, is there really a choice in going down that road? No. Yeah. Jeremiah? Okay. Lloyd, you didn't correct him. How come?
I couldn't remember either.
Jeremiah, Isaiah.
I read it.
Isaiah speaks against Israel and Jerusalem,
Right.
the city, and
Jeremiah writes, after it's falling, or in the about to fall, during the fall, and after the fall. And in that, he's saying, yeah, he's going to take out the rest of them, but you're coming too. So, okay, Jeremiah. All right, so we see this taking place. Think about Israel. In Israel, and the history of Israel, which is an example of God's people, we need to consider, because it is a physical illustration that we're to learn from to show us how God works with His spiritual people, us today. In that case, do you remember what He told them after Joshua died? I think it was in, I wrote it down, Judges chapter 2, verse 21 and 23. He was going to leave all the people that Joshua had not defeated in order to do what? Test them. Test them. So all the people that Joshua didn't drive out before he died, all the rest of them were left to test God's people. Guess what? Happened to Israel. 1 minute. Huh? 1 minute they failed the test. And they turned back to God. God said, okay, started covering them, and then they turned back, and turned back. David. What's the king that they were killed? where God uses them to try them. And every time they turn their back and start thinking they got it on their own, they're all okay, and I can take care of myself, and my crops are doing great, and I've got a good family, and everything's just great. My house is getting bigger. Now I got to build a bigger storehouse. God comes along and sends the Philistines or some of the other raiders to come in here and take it all away. Doesn't he? Kill your wives, take your barn, burn your barns, and take your produce and take it back to their place. And suddenly the ramifications come around there. Why? As a method of testing them and judging them. That takes place. That's what happens in our lives. As a matter of fact, I look around the United States, wealthiest country in the world, undisputed. We have wealth, power, strongest military in the world, undisputed. We have all these things. God has blessed us, but what is happening to us? So we turn away and think, look what I did. More and more, God says, fine. See what happens now. When I'm not helping you defeat these problems, what happens? And then suddenly we started getting ourselves in situations we see happening today. And certainly today's not new. This has happened in our country over cycles and everything. It's just the one we're aware of. And it seems to be the worst because time has come on and it seems like history gets worse every time it comes back around. But we see that. Look in your own lives. Doesn't Satan go after you at what you would decide without telling anybody, but in your own bedroom, this is where I'm weakest at? This is my biggest weakness. Doesn't Satan go after that? Yeah. He doesn't go after the things he knows he's not going to be able to disturb you on. He goes after the ways that he thinks he can get you. So that's what it is. It's a trials. Trials and judgments. A lot of consequences we deal with of that. And the last thing is the reason Jesus gave here is because that the works of God might be displayed. A lot of times the things that happen in this world, the blind man couldn't see from birth, had nothing to do with sin, had nothing to do with Adam's sin, had nothing to do with his mom and dad didn't do something that caused him to be that way before he was born. While he was being smoking, or I don't want to smoke because you're blind, but whatever,
Poking him with sticks.
Poking him with sticks, whatever. None of this happened. Instead, it was in order that the works of God might be displayed. Remember the walls of Jericho? They were told to march around and do all these things. Who knocked the walls down and gave them Jericho and defeated Jericho? God did. He told them what to do, which was basically make a bunch of noise so that they can know you're there, and then stand back and let God do it for you. Because I want to show them, you, and everybody around you, so that the works of God might be displayed. As a matter of fact, don't even take anything as pillage or plunder or whatever, because you didn't do anything. Doesn't belong to you. You didn't. Okay? So we see that. We think Romans 8:28. And I want to turn there real quick. I think it's way too long, we're running out of time. But 8:28, we know this. It says, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Most of the time we read this, and I've heard this, and I've said this before, I'll say it one more time. We hear this, and we think it's talking about me. When he says, those who love Him and have been called according to His purpose, He's not talking about me. He's talking about everyone who loves Him and is called according to His purpose. His people, which I am a part of. But not everything works for my good, but it always works for the good of God. Always. Ask Paul. You think being shipwrecked, beaten, and all the things happening to him work for his good? Think it made him feel better? No, many think he had a thorn in the flesh because of it. The result of his injuries. No. But it did work for the good of God's people. I'll take that back a step before that. There was a guy named, first of all, Jesus. Well, look what happened to him. What he did was not for his good, but for God's people's good. Because in him there was a guy named Stephen. Remember what happened to him? He got stoned. What happened to him was not just for his good, but it was for the people standing there. Matter of fact, one of them was holding a bunch of coats. What was his name? Saul. So Saul goes on from there and sees that, and he goes on and starts doing some things, and guess what? Things happened to Saul. Was it for his good? No, but it's for the good of his people. Sometimes the things that happen in our world, we can't once explain away by saying, oh, that's good for you. You'll see it someday that it was really beneficial. Because sometimes it's just not. It's just not. But the reality is God knows how to make it into something that works to benefit. David and Bathsheba. Do you realize she's in the lineage of Christ? Didn't come from any of his other wives. It came from Bathsheba. Okay. God uses those things for his will. Look at our own world. Look at our own life. Look at how God is affected in that. The last thing I want to touch on, I only have a couple minutes, but I'll try to get through it. It's what I call the purpose of the sign, the rest of the story. When you read the rest of this, John was trying to bring out something more important than this physical healing of this blind man. First of all, the man said, I was blind, but now I see. And he talks about blindness, but he goes on to talk about disciples. Talking about himself and talking about being a disciple. And there's a distinction here between disciples who follow after this Jesus and disciples who follow after Moses. He was one that was choosing to follow after Jesus. He goes on to say, only a man from God can open eyes of the blind. Makes sense? That was his view. In order to see, one must believe in Jesus. That was made clear here. Jesus has to be believed and all those different things, whatever. On the other hand, you got contrast in that. You got the Pharisees, who, after all this is done, look at Jesus and saying, what? Are we blind too? You know, they were disciples of Moses. Not really. That's what they said. They were disciples of what? Themselves. The law that they have written in their own law. They were disciples of themselves. What they wanted to do. The attitude there was only a sinner is going to heal on the Sabbath. Or God, they didn't think about that, even though they'd already been told. And those who choose to blind, Jesus said, those who choose to be blind are guilty of sin. Because they made a choice there. He made it all laid out, it was all clear, it was all there. We talk about the light of the world. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness did not understand. John starts his entire book off by saying that, first chapter. The light displays the works of God. The light makes it possible to see in a dark world. Jesus is light. Everything about God is light, and it's about that, Him, not about what these Pharisees were trying to do. Jesus is trying to say, these guys are blind. These religious elite, they're blind. They don't know what they're looking at. They're in the darkness. Instead, it needs to be in light. Healing comes from faith and grace. God provided what for this man to be healed? Blood and water. Did he? Blind man? Put mud on his eyes and told him, gave him a pool of water. But he also required the man to go do it. Go wash it out. Without either one of them, this man would still be blind. Today, a lot of times, it's the same thing with baptism. God provides what it takes to be forgiven, His Son, His blood, but He tells us to go be baptized. This guy here, Jesus spit in the dirt and then rubbed it on his face. Sometimes we go, oh yeah, that's, you hear that's not right, that's the meaning or whatever. You shouldn't have to do that. The fact of the matter is, it didn't matter. But both of those were required, and none of it saved him. God did it. But those were required in order to make it happen. All right, the last thing I got from here is that Jesus says, for judgment I've come into the world, the blind will see. Why? Because of the light and because of the washing. And the seeing will be blind. Why? Because of darkness and rejection of Him. Guilt is based on God's definition of seeing, not man's claim to being able to see. How many people in the world today do you hear claiming to be able to see? Oh yeah, I know I'm saved. I know I'm this. I claim this. I claim that. I'm sorry. The only way to determine that is God's definition. And this is another way to talk about this. All right. Talked a couple minutes over. Sorry. Hopefully we got something from that. Next week our lesson, I think, is